Everyone, this final plenary session of Share City 2020 with our keynote respondents, Professors Oksana Monk, Julian Agerman and Anna Moregas-Faus. My name is Anna Davis and I'm the PI of Share City and I'll be facilitating the discussion today. Hope you've enjoyed the rich presentations from scholars and food sharers alike over the past 3 days. We've been gathering your questions throughout the conference and please do send in any others via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen in Zoom during today's discussion as well. If we don't get through all the questions today, we'll follow up after the event, so do watch our website for updates. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Professor Julian Agerman is a critical friend of Share City and advisory board member. He's a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University in the States. His research critically explores relations between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by governments or social movement organisations, examining their effects on public policy and planning processes and outcomes. He's been an inspiration for me for more than 2 decades, particularly his influential concept of just sustainabilities, bringing justice issues to the core of sustainability debates. Julian is an acclaimed author. He's written many papers and books, including Sharing Cities, co-written with Duncan McLaren. He's co-founder and editor-in-chief of Local Environment, the International Journal of Justice and Sustainability. Dr. Anna Moregas-Faus is a senior research fellow at the University of Barcelona in Spain and a visiting research fellow at the Sustainable Places Institute at Cardiff University in Wales. Anna's research examines agri-food systems, food security and sustainability. As a result, she's very much leading discussions internationally around food justice and governance as well. She began her research career tackling aspects of sustainable rural development, looking at farmers' strategies, collective action, and the dynamics of alternative food networks, and engagement remains central to her research work. She's involved in participatory action research today with civil society organisations and public institutions internationally. And last, but by no means least, Professor Oksana Monk is a professor of sustainable consumption and production in Lund University, Sweden. She has a particular interest in innovative business models and policies for sustainable lifestyles in food, mobility and housing sectors. In addition, she examines innovative ideas around working with international organisations such as UNEP, and she was an international expert for the Task Force on Sustainable Consumption and Green Development in China. So together, Oksana, Anna and Julian bring a wealth of experience needed to help shape the transformation to more sustainable urban food systems and explore the potential for sharing to help do this. So in that vein, I'm going to start with a question for each of the panelists and then I'll throw the floor open to other insights from the panel. So just for the first question, I'll go to Julian first. Given your expertise on justice and sustainability, what do you see as the key challenges for food sharing initiatives who want to contribute to a just and sustainable food future?
Well, thanks, Anna, and thanks, Share City, for inviting me to this great 2-day conference. It's been really inspiring to see some of the more established people and a lot of junior researchers coming through. So again, thanks for that. The challenges, there are both challenges and opportunities. The challenges are the challenges that we've seen laid bare, and I know we're going to go on to talk about COVID, but I don't think we can, open this section without acknowledging how inequalities have been deepened and foregrounded by the virus, especially, and in the United States by the long overdue, perhaps, racial reckoning that we are going through right now. And it's painful, but it is causing introspection. And I think it is causing, and here's the opportunity, it is causing us to look at issues of justice and sustainability in cities. It's causing us to look at who gets access to public spaces, who gets access to growing spaces. Why are, even in my city, Cambridge, a very progressive administration, why are most of the growing spaces still sort of grandfathered to those in the know? Why don't the new immigrants to Cambridge get these growing spaces? So I think there are challenges but opportunities, and I want to talk really about the opportunities. And the opportunities, I think, are in terms of intercultural understanding. We live in increasingly different and diverse cities, and we all share the common thread of an interest in and a need for food. And there is no better, as your work has shown, Anna, there is no better way of understanding different cultures than breaking bread together. And so we're seeing a lot of projects that are specifically, and I think this is the key point, we will never get to social justice or more equitable cities unless we centre equity and justice, rather than having them being very desirable things after we've got the economic or environmental factors engaged. So I think this moment that we have now offers us an opportunity, knowing and having laid bare the great inequalities in our society, to really look at how to centre issues of social justice and equity. But again, we will never get to social justice or more socially just cities or more socially just local food systems unless we absolutely and intentionally and mindfully centre those issues. And we're starting to see in Boston now some programs, and I've written about these in terms of Boston's emerging local food solidarity economy. We're getting projects and programs where monetary exchange is not the main benefit. The main benefit is seen as people developing social capital, often across cultures and certainly across income groups. So I do see some challenges, but I think out of the challenges do come these great opportunities that I'm hoping we're going to talk more about during this session.
That's great, Julian. Thanks very much. And I think, yeah, there are some really inspirational sort of demonstration effect ideas. And I wonder, Anna, if you have experience of that in Barcelona. We know that there are some really progressive movements in Barcelona and perhaps more broadly. So would you have anything to comment there around particularly the justice dimensions?
I totally agree with Julian's points, of course, and I think one of the challenges is how we center justice in these initiatives, and how it doesn't just become this fuzzy word that we were talking about before, not just transitions, just food systems, but we actually enact what this means, no, in terms of like the cultural dimension of it and also the political dimension of it as well. So I think this is very, very relevant and a very big challenge for sharing initiatives. I think one of the things that has happened here, and of course I turn back to COVID as many of us do now, one of the experiences was to create this food bank, that it was like a community food bank where agroecological farmers were actually feeding people in need during COVID. So these new circuits emerge of like how we manage to give sustainable food for people in need, rather than dividing different types of like alternatives for like different socioeconomic groups. And I think this was a great seed that now needs to be kind of like expanded and nurtured to make sure that this continues, now this type of like sustainable food initiatives that actually merge different aspects of sustainability.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And you know, we talk a lot in terms, particularly in climate change arenas now, around just transitions. But the notion of what is just and justice is rarely unpicked. And there's a lot of emphasis on sort of distributional justice, I guess. But there's also procedural justice, restorative justice, recognition justice. So and I think, you know, the nuances around justice really do need to be unpicked a little bit more. And Oksana, I wondered whether you wanted to come in then on that matter, because clearly in other sectors of sharing, such as accommodation and mobility, there's been some real issues around injustices for cities as a response. And has your research kind of revealed any of those things?
Yes, indeed. If we look at the the difference between how cities react to different organizations, I've been thinking, why don't we see these big responses from city councils towards food sharing organizations? They are small and they perhaps do not have these adverse effects on the cityscape, so to say. But if we look at the many car sharing or bike sharing organizations or space sharing, including accommodation, there we see that these organizations, they start up with a very pro-social agenda, or at least with intentions to deliver social cohesion, to improve community feeling and so on. As they grow, and perhaps this, of course, enabled by ICT, but this growth model makes them shed the social intentions and aspirations on the way. And this makes cities see the adverse effects of these platforms emerging, kind of coming into city, taking over, questioning and putting in question many institutions and infrastructures. And luckily, we also see good responses from cities. Some are reactive, but many are proactive in a sense to define not only what business models or value creation models are allowed to emerge or come into the city, but also defining the level of activity that is allowed in the city. So for me, this is an interesting kind of turning point where cities realize, first of all, the power they have, but of course also understanding the effects this other types of sharing economies, sharing economy organizations are bringing, and putting a lead or trying to fit them to the scale of the city.
Can I just add a point there, Anna?
Yeah, good.
This, there's a near obsession with mobility. Now, mobility means how do we move people around? I think the justice and equity piece here is access. Why do we want people to move around? How do they move around, and to where? And I see a lot of, in urban planning, I see a lot of transportation planning around mobility. And again, mobility means nothing if we don't think about who gets to be mobile, in what ways, and to what ends. And so I really challenge urban planners, mobility planners to really think about this issue of access, because that's, in a sense, if we're thinking about access, we're thinking about social justice and equity and inequities. And then let's think about mobility once we've thought about why people want to move, who gets to move, and to where.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting point, and this whole matter of process and procedure and you know, what comes first. You know, what are the assumptions that are able to be unstable or destabilized from the current system? I mean, we hear a lot about the need for radical transformation of our systems, whether it's food systems or whether it's our urban systems, but still essentially some things seem to be off the page, you know, that they're not up for discussion. And I think until we get to those very fundamental issues around what is the purpose, what are we aiming for, what is our, you know, where's our end goal, then I think that these issues will just continue to be sidelined. I wonder if we can bring that then back to matters of food governance, Anna. And I had a question for you around, you know, what are the key governance challenges, building on what we've said here and the inputs from Oksana and Julian there. You know, what are the key governance challenges that food sharers face in terms of helping to transform our urban food systems onto more sustainable pathways?
This is, I think this is quite a difficult question, but I will build quite a bit on what it has been said already in this panel. And I think one of the key things is this idea of sustainability, that it means different things in different places for different people. And we had the example that I just gave before about Barcelona and this food bank during COVID, on how it brings local agroecological food to local people. But also we have, like, for example, a very big pig industry in economic terms, very important, which raises a lot of concerns in terms of like the social elements, in terms of jobs and so on, but also the environmental impact. And all of that, for example, is local. And therefore, like, this sustainability thing means different things in different places. So I think one of the challenges for food sharers is how to navigate this complexity of delivering sustainability when it means different things, but it also has different dimensions, and we should try to deliver those at the same time, no? Because that's the I think that's the strength of sustainability. There is no one dimension, but that it is connected. So navigating these tensions and trade-offs when you build this type of initiatives, I think is a key challenge. For example, do we pay higher prices to farmers at the expense of maybe excluding people in lower income? So do we support local shops that maybe their produce is not environmentally friendly, but or we go to bigger companies that deliver organic? Or is the ICT technology making things more accessible for some, but maybe it's excluding people like the elderly? So I think navigating these things is a key governance question, because about how we make those arrangements through these dimensions and who we work with and how we create mechanisms to actually deliver sustainability. I think one of the issues as well, another of the key governance challenge, it has to do with this thing of like timing and finding these workable solutions, because many of the initiatives, as you have shown in the project Share City, Anna, many of these initiatives are really based on the values and principles that are different to the norm, no, to the world that we live in some ways. So how we actually implement this type of values when the context and the structure that we have around goes so much against this, and we have things like, for example, like specific regulations that don't allow for sharing initiatives to do things in a certain way, from like food safety to kind of like collective ownership and so forth and so on. So we're kind of like building within this world a different world. So I think this idea of like how we do that, transitions are difficult, transformations even more. So how do we do this? I think it's a key governance challenge of this thing of temporality and how we adapt our governance arrangements to that in some ways. And the last thing I wanted to say around this is that I think also COVID has shown this very clearly, but that's the key questions around the food sharers and the relationship to the public sector, or in many cases, this relationship between community initiatives and the public sector, and what are these synergistic relationships that we can build. In my talk yesterday, I was highlighting this thing of like networks that were developed through COVID to support each other, to take care of each other, and how they were like actually public services were referring people to those networks because they didn't have capacity. So I think there's a lot to think about how we redistribute resources, capacities, how we build this system where food sharing is at the heart of this community initiative. So how we do this in a way that is efficient and that it delivers sustainability outcomes in a broader sense for more people.
No, I think that's really important. And there are two things there that I'd like to kind of pull out and maybe see if the other panelists have some responses to. One is the inherent short-termism of all political decision-making, and how the longer terms of, say, growing cycles, the food system sort of abuts against that. And also then the second point is around empowering the kind of grassroots. And what was one of the things that we found really interesting in Share City was that in certain locations there were these kind of initiatives which were set up as the connective tissue, if you like, between different other food sharing initiatives. So whether it's the kind of inspirational 596 acres in New York City, which basically helped communities to identify spaces which could become public, derelict spaces which could become spaces for community activities such as community gardens, which then subsequently inspired 3,000 acres in Melbourne to do a similar kind of idea. And it's interesting that these were organizations which were set up to help people understand this very complex, potentially fragmented system of urban governance. So it was very difficult for people to know who to go to, what to find out, to even take these kinds of ideas forward. So clearly matters of explaining what happens at the urban governance scale needs more attention for sure. And I wondered, Oksana, in your experience with the urban sharing project in different sectors, did you have a similar kind of experience around tensions around short and long-termism, around sort of navigating complex urban governance systems?
Mm-hmm. I have a different maybe take on the same question, and I'm thinking because our focus is on the organizations, sharing organizations, but also on city councils and municipalities. And what we see is that very different way of how they approach dealing with sharing organizations, linked to how they perceive the sustainability of these organizations and also the sustainability goals of the city itself. In Sweden, for example, many cities do see sharing as a more sustainable way of producing and consuming. So they weave this working with sharing organizations as part of their strategic plans. So we see much more support to non-profits, to grassroots from the municipalities. And for them, it's kind of very formal, becomes a much more formalized process. While in other cities, it's as I said, they take reactive position when suddenly big giants come and take over, and then cities need to respond. So of course, there is a lot of negativity, and they don't see really, they don't link it to sustainability. And it's interesting that you say that there are these kind of organizations that marketplaces, or maybe not marketplaces, but really, as you said, the spiders in the web that bring together the different organizations. Because we looked a lot more maybe on for-profits, we saw this kind of sharing economy trade associations emerging that are presenting themselves as advocating the interest of sharing organizations like Sharing Economy UK and similar things. And I was actually wondering if there are these middlemen in the sharing, food sharing cityscapes that are promoting and help make these organizations more visible. And here also just maybe one example, in Sweden also many cities are developing this smart maps where they do map all these different sharing initiatives as a way for municipality again to make them visible, to increase people using them, being familiar and engaging with them. So there are things I see also in other sectors where municipalities are actively engaged, even not only with big organizations, but also helping make the landscape of sharing visible to people.
That's really interesting, Oksana. Certainly in the Irish context, we also experienced the similar kind of for-profit lobbying umbrella group for the sharing economy, but it didn't really take off in the Irish context. I guess what we see in the food realm has been more sectoral umbrella groups. So for example, in Ireland, we would have Dublin community growers, the Irish community growers. Doesn't tend to happen internationally, and I guess that's a lot to do with the specificities of urban planning and regulations at the local level. In other areas such as cooking and eating, we didn't see so much of that umbrella kind of organization, and it was more, I guess, the 596 acres model is facilitating other people to share, so identifying spaces in particular for people to share in. So I wonder, Julian, if I could just come to you here on that for some hopefully inspirational kind of examples of where grassroots organizations or food sharers, food justice organizations have been able to successfully navigate the governing arrangements, and maybe some lessons we might learn from that.
Well, I just want to take a step back, Anna, because you mentioned a very important point, about the shortness of political cycles and the length of growing cycles and establishing community gardens, spaces for urban agriculture. And, I've been very influenced by the work of Nate McClintock, great work. And he talks about urban agriculture taking place in the interstitial spaces that we allow urban agriculture in many ways to happen when we can't think of what else to do with the land. And that in high land value cities, it's even harder to get urban agriculture. It's easier in Detroit or in certain places. But one thing I want to challenge, and again, I'd come to Anna on this, and it's a governance issue and it's a vision issue. When are mayors going to take a chance and say, we think the use value of urban agriculture is so high that we're going to give it a chance against the monetary value model that most mayors, I mean, in the US, we have the highest and best use of land. What does highest and best mean? It means the most money. It doesn't mean best in terms of what's best for the community. So I think one of our challenges is, can we get mayors, can we get governance systems where we have a different appreciation for land that can be used, shared land, common land that can be used by cities. And, I try to keep up with what goes on in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. And I think that in Belo Horizonte, they have prioritized city-owned land for community uses. So I want to see that happen. I mean, I think in the US, certainly, rezoning for urban agriculture has been a big success. And, my experience and my paper with Penn Low on the emerging Boston local food solidarity economy has shown that just one simple governance flip towards for-profit and non-profit urban agriculture has spawned a whole economy in the Boston area, centered on the farms, which are on community land trust land, and there's a for-profit farm and a non-profit farm, and both of these enterprises supply local food co-ops. Some supply local restaurants when we used to go to local restaurants, local composting facilities, composting some of the waste back into the community land trust land. So we've almost got an emerging solidarity economy where these organizations cooperate, and it's a circular economy as well. And it's a more socially just economy because most of these organizations have pledged to employ people from the local community. So there is a very, very strong focus. But in typical US fashion, this is laissez-faire. Nobody's guiding this. Nobody's growing this. If it grows, it will grow because it grows. And one thing I'd like to see is, or think about, is how can we arrive at some governance structures from these community-based organizations that help to guide this Boston model to grow in Boston and maybe to grow in other cities. So I think that there are deep, deep governance challenges here, but I think with a visionary mayor who is prepared to take on a use value view rather than a market value view for some land, I think would be a great help.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. Thanks very much for that, everybody. Oksana, I wanted to come to you next about maybe looking at some comparisons between different sectors of sharing, and this is where I know your expertise is really at the top. So do you see any kind of synergies and divergences between food sharing and other sharing sectors? And I suppose, you know, within this, you've already mentioned the kind of differences between commercial for-profit sharing and, you know, the grassroots sharing. And I guess in the food sector with Food Sharecity, we certainly found that while there are platform economies around food sharing, such as Eat With, this is particularly kind of eating together, social dining platforms, the space hasn't really taken off in the same way as the mobility and accommodation sectors, at least in the commercial for-profit arenas. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because I know you have your fingers across all of those sectors. So if you could maybe give us your insights about some of the key differences between the sharing sectors.
I'll do my best. I mean, first of all, I was thinking, okay, what is it? It probably has to do with the differences we see or observe. Perhaps, of course, to do first of all with the type of the product we're dealing with. Food is perishable. Use patterns, you cannot really consume it together or consume the same product over and over again. And also in terms of convenience of provision of the services, they are not available everywhere. Like, you know, I'm thinking then again, the size, Airbnb, Uber, wherever you go, you meet the same services, you're familiar with them. And they are there on demand. So first is the difference probably in the product itself. Then I was thinking more, and also I don't have the statistics yet for that, but I was thinking that impact on incumbent companies. You know, we've seen the impact on tourist sector, we've seen the impact on hotel sector, and again, we see the reaction first is reactive, but then we see that these kind of traditional sectors are adopting adjusting and kind of sneaking in, if not the whole business model of sharing, but some elements of it, like to, you know, booking systems, they are all becoming more and more ICT enabled and so on. So impact also, I haven't seen, or I was trying to imagine impact on restaurants. And of course, again, some restaurants are also trying to now provide services where you can order food online and some delivery services, but it's not to the same extent as in mobility, for example, as space sharing. And this, of course, has to do again with the size, that the possibility for the platforms in mobility and space to grow at the speed they are growing, and so they are able, or they create impact on the cities and the citizens. So this we don't see yet in food. And perhaps also, I mean, they are attracted because of the size and the negative impact they create in some cities, of course, with bringing positives. we haven't seen so much negative media around food sharing. It's kind of, you know, the food sharing practice is so ancient and it's part of our kind of social fabric. So I haven't seen much of the negativity around it, unless it's, yes, people when they share land or they take over land that are abandoned in cities and so on. So this is also quite different in my eyes. And then I think also the diversity of the sharing practices themselves is very different. I mean, of course, we have some free-floating bike sharing and stationary, the same thing in car sharing, but there is not such a kaleidoscope of practices that we see in food sharing, which also has implications perhaps for how difficult it is to develop maybe clear guidelines and communicate with those in governing positions on how to engage with this diversity of practices. It also is reflected in kind of an indiscriminatory regulatory process that we see in food sharing, but which are able so far to mostly distinguish between non-profits, grassroots versus you know, for profit. And there we also have, okay, food related risks and safety issues, but not really anything else. And while in space and mobility, we see much more kind of fine-tuned regulations targeting specific business models. So there is also, it might also be, I wonder if it may have to do with the maturity of the sectors itself. Although again, we've been sharing food and social kind of kinship settings for our whole history. So, but the market of this more commercial, I guess, platforms might be more kind of advanced in when we look at space and mobility. And yeah, maybe last one, I was thinking about this gifting, because it seems that in food sharing, there is much more this reciprocal non-profit and giving for free economy that we see in much more commercialized space and mobility sharing. So these are also quite a big differences.
Yeah, I think what we found, we did look at some commercial social dining platforms, and they very much adopted similar styles, procedures to some of the commercial mobility and accommodation sharing platforms, and have adopted a similar level of sort of devolution of responsibility down to those who participate, whether as guests or hosts in a social dining setting. I think that there haven't been any major incidents around the social dining spaces yet, at least in terms of where what we found in the research. So it means that really both the guests and the hosts don't see any precedents around having very negative health kind of responses, maybe, or safety responses. And maybe if that happens, then, you know, the attention to the sector might increase. But certainly you're right in terms of what we found when we mapped and scanned the landscape of food sharing across a number of cities, was that there's still predominantly non-market approaches to exchange that predominate in the food sharing initiatives, even those that are using information communication technologies, websites, smartphones, etc., to mediate their sharing. So we see quite a lot of the initiatives being pre-existing the smart technologies and adopting smart technologies to assist them, to enable them to do their work. And now so more than ever, I think. And I suppose now we really do have to get on to COVID and its impact. So before I go to some audience-based questions, I'd like to throw out to all three of the panelists now a question for you to reflect on. And I'll come to Julian first after I've said it. But I just wonder, you know, what are we to do now from where we are, given where we are with respect to COVID and the very uncertain future that we have? I wonder what you think we should do in terms of ensuring that perhaps some of the positive responses that have come from COVID become part of the infrastructure of our cities and, of course, beyond. So perhaps Julian, can I go to you first and just say, of course, the COVID has been a shock to everyone, and some more than others, and increasingly those who are least able to respond to the shocks have been most affected. So I just wonder whether you could give us some hope. Again, I'm always looking to you for this as a first response, in terms of how we can ensure that we support some of those positive things that we've seen come out, and support perhaps food sharing, which has been curtailed because of COVID, and how to support those in the future.
Yeah, Anna, it's a great question. I mean, I was just looking at some data. Project Bread, which is a statewide anti-hunger organization in Massachusetts, has noticed a 300% increase in food insecurity, which suggests that about 38% of Massachusetts residents are having trouble affording food. Massachusetts is a very, very wealthy state. It's one of the most wealthy states. You can only imagine what's happening in Mississippi, in Tennessee, in Alabama. I mean, this is a crisis. We've seen lines outside of food banks, people who would not ordinarily be using. So the emergency food system is in crisis in many ways. And yet, yes, as I talked in my first remark about the opportunities intellectually and collectively that we all see with, about the need to come together over this crisis, and yet the gap between that and I don't want to say the sharing response, because it makes it sound as if we in the sharing promotion world are not doing our jobs. But how do we connect that level of opportunity and awareness in people's minds with our ability in the food sharing world to have a real response? I don't have any immediate answers for that. I think that's something that we all could look into, Share City could look into, that gap between this absolutely high level of awareness and the capacity of sharing organization. I do think, again, and this is a point Anna might want to pick up on, I do think we need a governance-based response. I'm just reading the Boston Green New Deal at the moment, which has been put out by Councillor Michelle Wu, who is going to be standing as for mayor of Boston. This will be remarkable. If she wins it, she'll be the first woman and the first woman of color. But she identifies in her Green New Deal food justice issues. She talks about Seattle, which has for 40 years now had the Pea Patch program. They produce about 30,000 kilograms of organic produce a year that is shared, is gifted to senior centers, to schools, etc. But the really interesting thing, and again going back to one of my points, is that from the middle 2000s, City of Seattle adopted a racial equity strategy and insisted that every single department had to look at their programs and policies and strategies through the lens of racial equity. This has had a huge impact on the Pea Patch program and the ability of low-income, African-American, Latinx, immigrant communities to access land. So we do have examples of cities that I think are doing, are centering social justice and equity. We need it more than ever now, given this current crisis. But I think also, and this is something I think is typical of the United States, if it's just seen as minority communities, then politically, things can be brushed aside. But this crisis, this food crisis, is now moving into middle-class communities, white middle-class communities. So it's more of a political issue now under COVID. But let's go to that challenge of, we have people's awareness. What is the capacity of our sharing networks to respond?
That's a really important statement there. And I think I just came across some results of a RAP food survey, I think it was in the UK, maybe it was a general survey, when they were talking about the desire from the respondents across the population for greater and a greener future. So more collaboration, more interaction with each other, more interaction with nature, and the infrastructures around that. And can I go to you, Anna, now about that? I know that you've written already some really interesting work around the farm to fork strategy and the Green New Deal. And maybe you could just give your thoughts in respect to that and a post or during COVID future?
Yeah, I totally subscribe some of the things that you have been highlighting, the three of you, related to COVID. I think this is going to accelerate transition, or it has to accelerate action in some ways, because urgent action is needed. And I think what COVID is showing is that if we continue degrading the environment and degrading our health, this is very expensive. I mean, this element that Julian was putting on the table in terms of how we value economically empty spaces and things like that. Well, there's an economic dimension to it right now that I think we need to value fully. I mean, this crisis is insanely expensive for everybody. So let's kind of like be mindful of that, and how investing in resilience is actually a smart economic thinking as well, and not only, of course, in other sense, in other elements as well. So I would first say that I think there's going to be a lot of money invested in this reconstruction. I think here in Europe, we have this massive support that governments are going to receive, and they are going to be investing in things. We have to make sure that that investment goes to the right things, and we don't just think, again, short-term and quick economic recovery in places like Spain, tourism and construction and things like this, but we actually invest in things that are going to provide sustainability outcomes in the medium and short and long term as well. So I think this is very important. For that, I think that food sharing initiatives need to show that they are an alternative, that they are an option to build this kind of like this future and to deliver these outcomes. And I do think that during this crisis, there were governments, city governments, that were willing to engage with grassroots organizations, but there was no infrastructure to actually give rapid responses. And I think this has been like a wake-up call in terms of building those infrastructure, that connective tissue that actually allow us to be flexible and to adapt to the different circumstances, and to actually scale up and out and deep this initiative. So I think there needs to be more investment in this flexible social and also material infrastructure, because I think one of the things that at least many initiatives here in Spain, what they were calling for was the lack of access to resources, to buildings, to sites, to information of who needed help. So there's a lot there, I think, in terms of like making those connections and actually building those synergistic relationships. I think one of the key challenges that we're going to face is the increasing inequalities, and how this might polarize society in some ways, and how we're going to be dealing with those. So I think it's very important to not get very distracted by this disruptive politics, and do the hard work of like keeping the focus on where we're going and how do we want to do things, rather than being like just trying to like put out fires everywhere, because there's all the times disruptions with conflicts here and there. So I would say that that's kind of like some of the key things.
Yeah, that's great. And I know, I totally agree. We had similar kind of requests in Ireland here, exploring particularly surplus redistribution networks and food sharing initiatives, where the government was asking, what could they do? Could they be the network? And the realization that the government didn't have, a sort of a resilient network in place around food supply chain was, really, really concerning. And I hope that they don't have a short memory now, as you say, when the focus becomes on reinvigorating the community rather than maintaining it, that they actually think about these infrastructures. And I think both you and Julian have mentioned this word as like governance infrastructures. The need to sort of hardwire some of these ideas in governance is really important. And so can I come to you, Oksana, because clearly in other sectors, the COVID pandemic has had a major disruption on activities. I do remember seeing some video short of Airbnb talking about their amazing pivot in the space when COVID happened. But perhaps you could just talk to us a little bit about what has happened under COVID to some of the other sharing sectors.
Yes, of course, the impact has been devastating on many of these platforms. I'm just looking at the literature on that, and see very different numbers, between 40 and 70% less bookings on Airbnb and the hospitality sector overall, up to 90% reduced bookings on airline. And this is for, of course, obvious reasons. But at the same time, I've been also thinking that I see this lockdown is a way for us. There are these traditional theories of how we can change consumer behavior. If we only provide more information, it will change people's attitude, and then they will change behavior. And then there are recently other theories which say, no, we don't have time for this. But if we get people into the experiment of, or into the situation where they are forced to change their behavior, then when they've tried the behavior, then they can change their attitudes, and then this can kind of be established and refreeze and then freeze again the new behavior. And I'm thinking that this COVID gave us an opportunity of this a huge test around the world to actually test new ways of working and being at home or living, where we don't need to travel as much as we used to, where we can have perfectly fine conferences taking place online, where we don't need to disrupt our lives in order to communicate with the audiences and so on. And then also in that sense, I'm thinking in terms of sharing also about this idea of 15-minute city, where you need to be resilient. We need to have the infrastructure in place, which we can easily reach by walking or biking. And a lot of the sharing initiatives, they are pretty local, and they need to be supported also, linking to your hardwiring the cities and the governance mechanism. So I see this, of course, it's devastating for the businesses, and we'll see how they will be able to revitalize themselves afterwards. But I really see also new hope for new way of being, and also new hope when we see how people respond, creating this. We also here in Sweden, otherwise it's very all formalized, all the relations, but when the corona kicked in locally, suddenly all the Facebook groups were full of people saying, I will help you deliver food to elderly and so on. So I think there are a lot of signs of hope as well, and learnings. So don't waste a good crisis.
Okay, thanks, Oksana. That's great. I'm going to go to the audience questions. Thanks so much, everyone, for sending in those questions. I'm going to start by kind of putting together two questions. I have a great question from Rebecca Sandover, who's asking the panel, many cities and local authorities have declared climate emergencies, and have you seen any examples where this has increased support for local food and food justice initiatives? That's the question. And there is another question that's come in, which is asking what is meant by food resilience in cities. And I think this term resilience is often used in terms of climate change and climate emergencies, as well as food. So I'm just wondering if I can send that out to you, Julian, to start off with. Have you come across any examples where there's been this synergy between local authorities declaring a climate emergency and then also being increasingly supportive to food and food justice initiatives?
Well, so, to add to that, in the US, in addition to climate emergencies, some mayors have declared race emergencies, racial justice or racial injustice emergencies. So a double whammy, if you like, but none, to my knowledge, has had the sort of the joined up thinking approach to link this into other issues. When a climate emergency typically is, declared in the US, there's a automatic opening of libraries, swimming pools, cooling stations, basically. I'm not so sure what exactly a race emergency means, because it's a newer concept. But, again, a governance, a networked governance approach would say that these cascading emergencies do trigger some form of food justice response. Now, the social movements for food justice in the US have obviously been right on top of this, and this is playing into their hands, and there are increased calls. But I still don't identify any mayor in a US city as being what I would call a food mayor. We've got mayors who are big parks mayors or cycling mayors. When are we going to get the first food mayor who really gets it and gets the need for food justice, food security, and can link it to a climate emergency and, the racial reckoning kind of emergencies that we are now experiencing in the US. And of course, further out west, the ecological catastrophes of the wildfires. So here in the US, we have the ecological catastrophes happening on the West Coast. We have a long overdue racial reckoning, and we have COVID. So, it's thinking cap time in the US.
Yeah, let's hope that there are some positive movements in response to all of those aspects. Anna, could I just come to you about the food resilience question? Perhaps I know we use some of these terms quite broadly and loosely, and I wondered if you perhaps could give your kind of reading of what does food resilience mean in an urban setting?
Yeah, I wanted to add maybe a little bit to the food and climate change. I think it was last year that C40 kind of like promoted like a good food kind of like manifesto, where 14 cities kind of like pledged that they were going to reduce the amount of meat that they were consuming, that they were going to reduce food waste. So there's something around trying to lead this kind of like climate and food kind of like challenges from cities. But I do think that there's no like such a direct implication of food sharing initiatives, as Rebecca Sandoval was saying. It's more about maybe the meat and food waste agenda, but not so much how this is going to be done and where communities play a role in this. I think that's still kind of like quite broad and not that kind of like a specific. But next year here in Barcelona, there would be the Milan Food Policy Pact, hopefully, meeting, and climate is gonna be like quite a big thing. So I think that we should probably watch out for that in terms of like how cities are linking to climate and where food sharing comes into this. In terms of food resilience and cities, I think this is very interesting, because cities cannot be food resilient in some ways, isn't it? Because they are mostly fed from food coming from other places. So if you take a resilience perspective for cities and food, you of course need to think beyond the city boundaries in many ways. And I think many cities are looking at this in different ways. And there was a very interesting report in New York when it was looking at and some of the risks in terms of like access to food and how they were relying on how the food supply got into the city, and how most of the food was just going through one bridge. It was getting into the city through one bridge, and how that was like, this is the bridge that feeds like New York City. And also through the COVID pandemic, New York was rethinking about how to reconnect with local and regional farmers to kind of like create more of a regional food economy. And I think this is very key. I think all the cities are thinking about the metropolitan areas and how to reconnect with that. But I think we need to have a more territorial approach when we think about food resilience in cities. It's very difficult to just look at the city boundaries to build this up.
Sure, great. And I'd just like to go, we have less than 10 minutes left, so I would like to go to a couple of the other questions. I'll come to you, Oksana, maybe for the next one, or anyone really. It's a very interesting question from an attendee. And it really, I suppose, addresses some of our assumptions, perhaps, because the question is sharing food really socially just or good for the economy? I keep thinking about the poor baker whose business is undermined by a non-profit initiative or negative side effects of good for free for certain segments of the population. An abundance of free sharing services might be detrimental to some people's way of life. So I guess this is all around a kind of diverse economies setting, and how you manage perhaps precarious work and employment in the for-profit sector, as well as these there's some grassroots initiatives that we've been talking about. Does anyone want to come back at that question?
I guess one kind of perspective is, of course, when new things are developing, there are always losers and winners. Then in terms of what is socially just and good for the economy, also nothing is, perfect and absolutely sustainable and absolutely socially just. There are always different actors, and some again are winning and some are losing on this. So I think I think we need to have a more nuanced view on this. And I mean, it's good to bring attention to that issue. There is just economy is not just for everybody. Again, there is always, Juliana, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is in a way, it's like sustainable development. We have 3 dimensions, there is always, it's a balancing act. So I think in the social justice, it's as well a lot a balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Oksana. It's a great question, and I'd need longer to think about it and to try and pull some examples, of those tensions. But, equity and justice is a journey. It's not necessarily a destination. And I think if we think about it as a journey, we're going to get these wrinkles, these tensions, and we need to work through them. And if we had a more diverse set of economic provisions, perhaps these tensions would be lessened. But at the moment, we are programmed into a system where there are winners and there are losers. And I think, the work of Gibson Graham and the work of, the work on solidarity economies and cooperatives, I think is really where we need to look. I mean, it's no coincidence that, during the big recession of 2008, 2010, I mean, the Mondragon cooperatives weathered the storm relatively well. And cooperatives did much better than, the sort of standard shareholder business model. So again, I think, like Oksana, it's a very nuanced sort of question, and would be answerable in different circumstances, I think, in many ways.
And Anna, do you have any thoughts about the tricky stuff?
Yeah, I would just like to add there, I think it is related to what I was saying at the beginning of how these difficult questions in terms of trade-offs, of do we buy to the local shop if it's not organic, and all of these things. I do think that trying to work in real settings, in real communities and in real places help us navigate this much better, and engaging with real people. I think one of the things that is like a risk of maybe some ICT technologies is the detachment from place. And I think this is one of the things that we need to reclaim, that they are a tool to be put in place. And I think this can really help us navigate collectively these tensions and think about what opportunities might arise, or how we can, well, when there are losers, see who are the losers and how we can maybe do something about it, and how the community can do something about that. So I do think there's something about grounding these things and dealing with them from the ground.
Thank you very much. No, that's really important. And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here in terms of the questions right now. I know there are a few more in the box, and we will get to those after the conference. But I do want to give all the panelists just a last word. And I've been, I suppose, the despairing optimist in me has been trying to pull out the positives in what is a very challenging and very serious situation. But if I could go to you each in turn and just say, perhaps you could give a final comment on the space of sustainable food sharing and your hopes for a sustainable future. And yeah, I could go to Julian first for that, please.
Thanks, Anna. I continue to be inspired by Belo Horizonte. From the 1990s, from the Socialist Worker Party mayor who established the food security system in Belo Horizonte, in which the city fixes the price of certain foodstuffs that private sector retailers can sell to people on benefits, to community gardens that sell to schools. The whole network and the urban-rural interface between Belo Horizonte and its hinterlands, that system has not been picked apart by successive mayors, by successive administrations, to the right or to the left. We progressive policymakers, if we can embed good policy, it is very difficult for subsequent administrations to pull it apart. And the Milan Policy Pact has singled out Belo Horizonte as being the way we need to go. One question that people in Belo Horizonte have been asking is, why aren't other cities doing this? Why aren't other cities more hands-on in the food system like Belo Horizonte is? And so, again, I think, and it comes back to issues of governance, vision, and it costs less than 2% of the city's annual budget. And remember, Francis Moore Lappé calls this the city that abolished hunger. We can do it. We've just got to put the governance systems in place.
Thanks very much, Julian. That's great. And Anna?
Yes, I will totally build on what Julian has just said. I think is the moment for bold action. What is possible in terms of policy and collective action, I think now we see that those limits are not the limits that we thought they were. There's much more possibilities in terms of like investing, in terms of supporting each other, in terms of like individual actions, but also collective ones, and of course from like policy development. So I think we have to be bold about it. We have to be brave, and it is a moment to do those things. So of course, like escalate and replicate the model of Belo Horizonte and all those initiatives that are there, and really embed them so that we don't have to be in the constant fight for like small pieces, small wins, but they are actually the norm, that we don't have to continue fighting like decades and decades so that they remain where they are, no? So that it really becomes something permanent and kind of like more long-term.
Thank you, Anna. And Oksana?
I've been thinking about this COVID situation and the resilience of cities, and also I think it's really paramount that we develop the structures that we can feed ourselves even if we close borders. And I think this is actually amazing that it's not more hunger now in the world, well, when our global supply chains have been kind of slowed down but haven't stopped, but I think it's a warning sign.
No, I think you're right, and thank you again, Julian and Oksana, for your participation both in the conference and in this panel, and also importantly for the research that you're all doing. I really look forward to hopefully working with you again and continuing the conversation beyond the conference. I'm pleased to say that Anna and I, along with Jane Battersby and Jill Clark, are editing a new handbook on urban food governance that will come out next year, so keep your eyes peeled for that. I'm really excited also to join Julian and Duncan McLaren as an editor in a new book series on sharing cities with Policy Press. And Oksana, it'd be great to develop further our knowledge exchange between the Urban Sharing Project and Share City in the future. So finally, I just want to thank all the presenters and the food sharers for participating over the past 3 days, to the current research team for all the work that they've done behind the scenes. Seriously, getting the technical work done to support this virtual conference has been a baptism of fire, and they've done a fantastic job. Also, thanks to you, the audience, for participating, and please don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you want to find out any more about any aspect of the research project that you've heard about in the past 3 days. All of the presentations will be available on the conference platform for another 2 weeks, so please do view at your leisure. We will migrate them ultimately to our website after this time. As I mentioned at the beginning of the conference, we still have work to do in the Share City project, and we're looking forward to visualizing future scenarios, extending engagement with the Share It tool, and developing a manifesto for sustainable food sharing. And I'll certainly be drawing on some of the great insights from the panelists today on the need for good policy, the need for solid infrastructures, the need for good governance, the need for being brave. And I think that I've learned a lot also from today's session. So thanks very much again, and thanks again from all of us at Share City, and everybody enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.